I'm like, what happens if you search communism on YouTube? Like, what actually just comes up? What are the first things that people are seeing when they search communism? Because obviously it's worth responding to those things if they have a lot of views or they're popping up on people's page. And what I got was this. I had got this why communism video, but at first this was the only thing that popped up, or the top thing that popped up. It has 1.2 million views. This is an absurd video from an absurd man, Jordan Peterson, a bourgeois ideologue, one of the prized ideologues or intellectuals of the bourgeoisie. So I think it'll be worth it to respond. Hi, Eddie. In my opinion, Jordan Peterson might be the silliest man alive. He might be. I mean, one of the things we're going to talk about today is it's almost embarrassing that this is someone who's held up, in our culture, in our society, as like a leading public intellectual, right? Like, this is, a lot of people consider him really smart. Like, this is one of the smartest guys we got. And, the lack of, not only just his opinions, right? His political opinions, because whatever your political opinions are, you can still do good scholarship, right? You can still stick to the scientific method, stick to the facts. And even today, you'll see I'm going to quote a lot of historians who aren't Marxists, right? Non-Marxist Soviet historians or sinologists who study China. And, you can come up with accurate results, accurate analysis, accurate statistics, even if you're an anti-communist, even if you're a liberal, right? Just by using scholarly rigor and being honest in your scholarship. And that's never, ever, ever what Jordan Peterson does. So it's not even just his political opinions that are frustrating or make him so silly. It's the lack of intellectual rigor, the lack of scholarly rigor that he consistently shows, despite believing himself to be incredibly intelligent and despite being propped up by our culture as a leading public intellectual. But of course, in a culture, in a society dominated by the ruling capitalist class, where they can buy anything with money, this is the kind of person they're going to boost. This is the kind of person they're going to support. Somebody who pushes the narratives that they find useful, right? They're not going to boost someone like me. They're not going to boost an institute like Midwestern Marx. We've been banned from TikTok 7 times. Let's get into Jordan Peterson's video, The Truth About Communism, this lecture that he gave. I don't know who paid him to give this lecture or what. A lot of times these speaking engagements are funded by various NGOs, various political groups. So you have these non-governmental organizations that is what they're called, and they're heavily financed by like the Koch brothers or various banks, various large corporations, various think tanks and political institutes, which are funded by the same people. And this is one of the main ways that corporations and the ruling capitalist class push their ideas, not just marketing their ideas in general, but pushing their ideas into the academy, right? Pushing their ideas into the mainstream of academia, meaning not just blasting them over a loudspeaker to the regular populace, but getting ideologues like Jordan Peterson to push these ideas within the education system, within colleges, things like that. And then obviously the speeches can be recorded and, put on the internet and stuff too. But when I was researching Yeonmi Park, one of the North Korean defectors who's heavily funded by right-wing libertarian NGOs and political think tanks, I was finding that there was overlap between the political think tanks who support and boost her content and those who produce, boost, and support Jordan Peterson's content, which is probably how he got hooked up with Yeonmi Park and ended up doing an interview. But either way, now we have a bunch of speeches from people like George Bush and people like Hillary Clinton and people like Jordan Peterson. And they're paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to go up here and talk about nonsense. And you would expect, their scholarship to be super rigorous and super good and super based on facts, given that they're being paid so much money just to speak to people. But no, it's actually the opposite. You need to pay people that much money in order to get them to lie to people and push these bourgeois ideas on people and on the academy. So let's give it a listen.
Now, Nietzsche said back in the late 1800s that after he said that God was dead, and I suppose that would also be the theory that of suffering that I outlined at the beginning that is at the basis of Judeo-Christian civilization, that God was dead and that people had killed him and that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It's a paraphrase, but I've got the basic message right. And he also said there'll be two consequences of that: nihilism, because there's no transcendent meaning, and a move to totalitarianism because people can't tolerate nihilism. He said the most likely pathway to totalitarianism would be communism, essentially. He didn't quite use those words, but he meant that. The words are close enough. He said socialism, but I'm going to use communism to distinguish it from democratic socialism. And he said that probably tens of millions of people would die in the 20th century as we played out that experiment. And then he said, but it might be worth it if we learn something from it. Rough, man. I mean, and unbelievable. Like, I cannot figure out how in the world he knew that was going to happen.
If you read Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, or if you watch the breakdown of Maps of Meaning by the awesome YouTuber Hakeem, you'll realize that a lot of times Peterson just makes stuff up and he reads meaning into things, right? He just projects his own meaning or what he wants things to mean into them, right? So that's how you get this theory of Nietzsche predicted Stalin, I guess. He just reads Nietzsche and he's like, oh, he must be talking about the communism of the future. You know, how did he do this? He reads into things a lot. And if you read Maps of Meaning, like, it's hard to explain, but he'll take these isolated events, you know, historical events or things that happen, and connect them in weird ways that they don't really connect to try and draw meaning from them, which is why he calls it Maps of Meaning. But really what he's doing is just reading his own meaning into everything that he reads. That's the Jordan Peterson method of scholarship.
Especially so far in advance. But Dostoevsky knew the same thing. He wrote this book called The Devils, or The Possessed. You could read that. That's a great book. It takes about 150 pages to get going. But once it did, like, everything snapped together after that, you know, and then it moves. And it's basically his prophecy about, it's an examination of the kind of person who had arisen in the aftermath of the death of God in Russia, who would lead the communist revolution. That's essentially it. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. And it's a great intro to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which describes what did happen when those sort of people took over the revolution. So let's look at what happened after the revolution. And we might say, well, how about we replicate the experiment a few times? Because you know how it is. If you're running a scientific experiment, you want to find out what something does if you allow it to behave. You don't want to just run it once because, well, maybe there was something specific about those conditions that led to the outcome. You want to generalize it across.
True. And socialism being an experiment, you want to learn from the mistakes of the past, which is why if you look at the inner debates within the Communist Party of China, the debates going on between Mao and others as to how to industrialize and construct socialism, move out of this impoverished feudal mode of production that they were in previously. They're very, very, very closely analyzing what the Soviet Union did, what Yugoslavia was doing, what all of these other socialist experiments were doing in their early years, so China could then, you know, take what worked and leave behind what didn't, which, you know, allowed them to collectivize and industrialize even faster than the USSR. China's industrialization process was the fastest in human history, and the USSR's was second. But, you know, socialism is an experiment, and, you know, Marxism is using the scientific method to understand society. So we should therefore learn from all the societies of the past. I don't think that's what Jordan Peterson means when he says that, though.
Across multiple circumstances. So we might say, well, let's take this set of ideas and let's run it on a large scale over a very long period of time in a variety of exceptionally diverse cultures and languages. So let's do that. Okay, well, we can first start with the Soviets. People, even now, because it's like the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, are celebrating Lenin. It's like, that's not good. That's like celebrating Hitler. Okay, I'm dead serious about that. It's not good.
Oh, my favorite part about that is the audience laughs at him, and he's like, I'm dead serious about that. No, I'm very serious about this, you guys. They're laughing at him when he says celebrating Lenin is like celebrating Hitler. And this is what I mean, like, but when I say it's embarrassing for our society that these are our public intellectuals, this is considered one of the smartest people in history, and then he's saying stuff like that. Like Lenin should be considered the same as Hitler. Like, which country beat Hitler, Jordan? Which country took 80% of the casualties in World War II? You know, which country was directly invaded by Hitler's forces, the Nazi forces, and beat them back, when every Western analyst in existence was saying that there was no hope of the Soviet Union defeating the Nazis? It was the Soviet Union. Spoiler alert, I just said it. It was Lenin's Soviet Union, and without the Russian Revolution led by Lenin, they absolutely would not have industrialized their country at the speed they did and defeated the Germans. Absolutely not. They didn't have the military capacity. Part of the reason they were able to win when every Western analyst thought they wouldn't was because of the mass production of tanks, right? Which was only possible because of central economic planning, which was only possible because they had a socialist revolutionary government in power who said, look, the Germans are arming up and getting ready to invade. We need to build up our military forces, our military capacity, our capacity to defend ourselves. And after the Western powers tried to destroy the revolution and place sanctions on the Soviets and things like that. They also industrialized. They also ended illiteracy. They also expanded healthcare. They also did all these things, but they mass-produced tanks and mass-produced things to build up their military capacity much faster than the Germans. The Germans were more focused on, they were too focused on making their tanks perfect, right? On producing the best tanks, the most specialized tanks. But the method of Soviet mass production, right? Producing these tanks using, central economic planning, using socialist planning, producing these tanks that were functional, but wouldn't take that much time in production, that wouldn't take a super long labor process to make, ended up being the superior way to go. That ended up being the superior strategy. And they were able to, in a matter of 20 years, build up their military this incredible amount to the point where they could defend themselves from the Germans. And they did. And, without them, it's likely that fascism would have taken over most of the world. But yeah, Lenin, who did that, is the same as Hitler, who invaded Lenin's country. They're both equal.
And the fact that people can dare to
That was sarcasm, by the way. Sorry.
think that that's okay means that there's something wrong with the way that we look at history. Lenin was a monster. And if you want to know about that, you can read Solzhenitsyn's writings about Lenin. Because the communist apologists say, well, it wasn't Lenin. Lenin was a good guy.
And he uses Alexander Solzhenitsyn as one of the main scholars, or one of the main bases of his work. And Solzhenitsyn was very biased against the revolution, was an apologist for the monarchy, who also at many times lauded Western liberal democracies, who were obviously the countries who boosted his lame-ass work with their money. But he made lots of claims, such as the claim that the gulags were worse than the Tsarist torture chambers, than the torture chambers that existed in Russia when they had a feudal monarchy dominated by these dictatorial czars. And that's just, not accurate. If it's hard to, say which one is worse, but if you're going to do that, the Tsarist torture chambers were worse, right? The gulags were labor camps where they were getting labor out of people and trying to do re-education of criminals through labor, right? It was considered a method of rehabilitation. And that's what it was considered globally at the time, not just within the Soviet Union. And then eventually, they got rid of the gulags in the 50s, I believe. After Stalin, they got rid of the gulags. But the Tsarist torture chambers were there the entire time, right? And there was no intent to rehabilitate. The intent was to threaten people. We're going to throw you in the torture chambers, these horrific prisons, if you disobey us. And it was only a method of punishment. There was no rehabilitation involved. Not to say the gulags were awesome or anything, but you can't distill the entire Soviet Union down to the gulags. Now, the thing about Solzhenitsyn's, his Gulag Archipelago book, that is the basis for so many of Peterson's arguments and so much of his scholarship, is that it's considered an experimental history, right? Why is it considered an experimental history and not just a nonfiction book? Well, because it is technically a work of fiction. It's taken from the author's own personal experiences and various sources that he read, and used to create a narrative about the gulags. So what do we call this nowadays? Historical fiction, right? Where you take, you draw together historical experiences or historical sources that are real, to tell a story or to give a narrative that's not entirely non-fictional. So that's what the Gulag Archipelago is, essentially essentially a fiction book, and that's the basis for everything that Jordan Peterson believes about the USSR. And it's like, if your opinions are so correct, and if these accusations you make against the USSR are so damning, they're so terrible, and they make the whole socialist experiment worth throwing in the trash and never trying again, Why can't you use regular statistics and regular data to prove that argument, right? Why can't you use regular statistics and data about the gulags? Why do you have to use a historical fiction book called Gulag Archipelago? Why do you have to use an experimental history? Why can't you just give us the history? Right? It's because if you actually went into the data and the statistics, which a lot of people have done, and compared them to this Gulag Archipelago book, you would find that, it's not accurate. A lot of the statistics are stretched because it's ultimately a work of fiction that tries to make the revolution look bad, because Solzhenitsyn hated the revolution, and was having his work boosted and funded by Western liberal Democrats or Western liberal finance capitalists. So he, stretched it to make the gulags look as horrible as he possibly could. And that's the basis for Peterson's scholarship. What a rigorous scholar he is. What a great academic who, just digs into all the sources and makes sure that everything is accurate before he speaks it in front of millions of people. Sarcasm again there.
It's all motivated by love of the working class. It's like, well, his henchman was Stalin. And if your henchman is Stalin, you're not a good guy. and Lenin was around during the early collectivization.
Stop saying Stalin like that. Stalin. It was Stalin. It was Lenin and Stalin. I don't know if Stalin was his henchman, and also Stalin was elected by the Soviet people. It's not like Lenin just said, I'm going to die soon, now you're in charge. But how can you say that post-revolutionary Russia was worse than pre-revolutionary Russia? How can you say that, Jordan Peterson? You talk about Lenin like he's just this horrible person. Lenin just thought his ideals were correct and he didn't care how many people he killed. That's not the case. But do you want to know why Lenin was so committed to revolution? Do you want to know why Lenin had such unbreakable will and unbreakable determination when it came to having a revolution in Russia and changing the political system? It's because his brother was murdered by the Tsar. His brother was executed. He was a political execution by the monarchy, right? This is the conditions that the Russian people were living in at the time. They had like 17% literacy, which went up to 99%, a few years after the revolution and the literacy programs at launch. They had like 17% literacy. Their people were peasants. They were dominated by giant feudal landlords. They had a little bit of manufacturing and industry, but it was mostly a peasant economy and agricultural or agrarian society. And then they were dominated by this dictatorial monarchy that had torture chambers and horrific prisons like we talked about before. But they would also kill people who went against them, which is why Lenin had to go into exile multiple times. Right? But the revolutionary movement that overthrew that and then taught everybody to read and industrialize and beat the Nazis is much worse. I mean, that's just historically inaccurate. It's just not true. There were constant famines before the revolution. Right? Pre-revolutionary Russia had famines all the time, anytime there were bad weather conditions. And you're going to hear Peterson talk a lot about famines in the early USSR, but for some reason, he never mentions the pre-revolutionary famines, which after the collectivization and industrialization process, which he's going to poo-poo, went away. There weren't any more famines anymore. Their resources in pre-revolutionary Russia were constantly used on senseless imperialist wars for the Tsar. That's part of the reason the revolution happened, because the military mutinied, because they were tired of just constantly being sent back and forth to fight to the death for accumulation of this dictatorial monarchy. And, of course, not only were they dominated by that monarchy, but the landlord class, the feudal lords. So Russia was in a, and this isn't, of course, to say post-revolutionary Russia was perfect or the gulags were awesome, nothing like this. I'm saying, look at what they had in pre-revolutionary Russia. Look at why Lenin was so committed to revolution. It was because his brother was murdered by the monarchy and the entire country was living in poverty while these monarchs lived in absurd, opulent, unimaginable wealth, which they were constantly sending Russian people to go fight and die in wars to expand, to accumulate more wealth. It was absolutely better after the revolution. And, Even an anti-communist, anti-Marxist historian should be able to acknowledge that. What would you have done in those conditions, Jordan Peterson? You always talk about government authoritarianism and repression and why we need to fight against it. If your brother or one of your family members was murdered by the state for speaking out against it, and there was no industrialization and nobody knew how to read in our country, and everybody was just working all day in the countryside for these feudal lords, you wouldn't want to rise up?
The early collectivization. And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he was perfectly willing to have any number of people die as long as his ideological system could be brought into being. So there's no celebrating Lenin. There's no we're cool, young, Marxist, hip revolutionaries, and he's our idol. It's like, there's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent.
So there it is. You got to individualize it and moralize it and be condescending towards people. Anybody who supports this collectivization process, which ended famines in the USSR, like we said, is just evil and stupid, unlike me. Right? When the collectivization and industrialization of agriculture is what ended famines in the country. It is what stopped famines from happening when famines had been happening very, very frequently for years and years and years and years and years and killing millions of people. Right? But when they carry out economic planning policies, which stopped that, yes, there were still famines in some of the early years of the USSR, just like there had been famines for years and years and years. And yes, these happened while they were collectivizing, while they were trying to move towards this new form of agriculture, industrialized agriculture. So you can associate the collectivization process with famines, but that doesn't mean that the collectivization process were the cause of the famines, when you have weather conditions and various other conditions that led to the early famines in the USSR, but especially when that collectivization and industrialization process ended the famines, made it so the future people in the USSR wouldn't die because they were hungry. But that means nothing to Jordan Peterson. Famines, aren't something that he actually looks at in their historical context, right? A famine is just something that allows him to point or blame on the USSR, something he can use as a rhetorical tool to say that the USSR is bad. People died in this famine, therefore this governmental system is bad, even though it ended famines. And this process of industrialization in the USSR and collectivization was the fastest process of industrialization in the history of the world at that point, and it would only be overtaken years later by China, right? Because China could learn from the mistakes of the USSR. The fastest industrialization process in the world is what Jordan Peterson thinks is evil and wrong. When the US and Europe industrialized using slavery, right? A lot of the major manufacturing capitalist entities in the US and Europe at the time were textile mills. They were making clothes, and they were incredibly dependent on the giant unlimited cotton market that was coming out of the US South, produced by slaves. But that's awesome. Jordan Peterson says Western society, European and US society are ideal, right? You can't get any better than this. This is the best society ever imaginable, right? Even though we use slavery and horrific exploitation and the genocide of indigenous people to industrialize this country. But, that's not as bad as the USSR, because some people died from famines while they were trying to industrialize agriculture and stop people from dying from famine. It's so ridiculous. It is so ridiculous when you look at the industrialization process in the USSR and, try and say it was evil and try and say Lenin did it because he hated people and just wanted to kill so many people. And then he's so condescending. And this is, the condescension that you get from a lot of bourgeois ideologues like Peterson. If you have a problem with capitalism and you want to move towards socialism, you just don't know anything, right? You don't know anything. You're just a kid. Here, let's play it again, shall we?
Not if you know anything. There's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent.
You just don't know anything. You're just not decent. Like, dude, I promise I have spent a lot more time studying the processes of collectivization and industrialization in the USSR and China than you have. A lot more time trying to figure out what actually happened. So don't sit here and tell me and other young people that we just don't know anything or we're just not decent like you. No, we just actually look into history. We do it in a rigorous way. We accept facts when they can be proven to us, right? Whereas you will jump to any conclusion that makes socialism look bad because it's popular and it allows you to do speaking engagements funded by right-wing NGOs who, are ultimately funded by the capitalist class, the ruling class in our current society. Right? So he can just repeat that over and over again. Nobody would support socialism if they're decent, if they know as much as me. So freaking arrogant. You can repeat that over and over to young revolutionaries, but what we can't do is prove it's true, right? Because we're actually going to look into your sources. We're actually going to look into the Gulag Archipelago. We're actually going to look into the Black Book of Communism. And guess what? If they're bullshit, which they are, we're going to figure it out. Because we're not charlatans like you, Jordan. And, that lack of facts, that lack of factual evidence, material basis of which to base his arguments off of, is why he gets so emotional, right? It's why he gets emotional when he's like, Lenin is the same as Hitler. And people laugh at him. He's like, I'm serious, right? Because he can't convince everybody anymore that capitalism's the way to go. And this is the best society imaginable. And we shouldn't try and do anything better, right? It's becoming harder and harder for him to convince everyone that we can't have anything better, especially when our generation is watching capitalism tear up the world, push us towards an environmental crisis, push us into constant wars, allow people to die of starvation every day, right? We're watching this. We know what capitalism is like, and we're becoming more and more skeptical of people like you who tell us that no better system is possible because there was a famine in 1930, right? Prove to us that socialism is worse than capitalism if you can. Prove to us, but you can't prove it to us, which is why you need to use a experimental history, right? Which is why you need to use books like the Black Book of Communism or like the Gulag Archipelago, which is essentially historical fiction. Because if you actually went into the data and the statistics and the development of the USSR over time, you would see how fast they industrialized and how fast they raised standard of living for their people, despite the many mistakes that were made. And then that would debunk your argument that we can never make our current society any better, our current system any better, because of the famine in 1930, like I said.